Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey. 10. One morning, David saw men stringing a huge Anchorage Fur Rendezvous banner across the main street. An electric excitement gripped the city. This was the great Anchorage celebration he'd heard so much about. The carnival time of the year for the city. The highlight of the celebration would be the dog race. It drew the greatest teams from Alaska and beyond to compete for a cash prize of thousands of dollars. This was the race Smiley Jackson pointed for in the months he trained his team at Aurora. Scrub would be there. David could hardly wait for Grace to get off the bus that night to tell her. "Of course," she said. "School's going to close for the 3-day celebration." "Gee, are you sure Scrub will be here? I'll get to see him?" "Sure," David said. "Smiley Jackson would never miss the big one." They walked a block in silence. "I looked in that jewelry store window the other day," Grace said. "The little ivory dog's gone." It was on the tip of David's tongue to tell her he'd bought it. Then, for a reason he couldn't explain, he said, "I know." A few days later, the mushers began to arrive with their teams. They came to the city by truck and pickup, by train, and even by plane from north of the Arctic Circle. They mushed in from several hundred miles in the interior and from the southern part of Alaska. A dozen came from the Yukon Territory, 2 from the state of Washington, and 1 from as far away as Massachusetts. In all, 30 teams were there to fight for the big prize, money and the honor of winning the greatest event in the North. When the paper published their names, that of Smiley Jackson was among them. His backer was one of the Anchorage stores. The mushers and their teams were scattered throughout the city. David searched everywhere for Jackson. He asked other mushers, but at first no one seemed to know where the team from Aurora was staying. Finally, a young Eskimo said, "Smiley Jackson? Sure. Go to the end of the street. There's a trail leads out of town. Follow it about a mile through the brush and you'll come to a little log cabin. He's holed up there." David found the cabin. The dogs were staked out around it. There was a smell, rotting at the edge of the brush, about 100 feet from the cabin. He crept to the shed and peeked around. The nearest dog was Scrub. He stood broadside as David had seen him do so often. His big head was up, sharp ears pricked forward, plumed tail curved over his back. David studied him closely. He seemed broader of shoulder and deeper of chest. He looked strong and well-fed. His coat shone. He had a lead dog's air of confidence and authority. The whole team appeared to be in top condition. David searched for signs of Jackson. No sound came from the cabin. No one passed before the small curtainless window. No smoke issued from the stovepipe. Jackson must be downtown. He stepped from behind the shed and started toward the dog when the cabin door opened and Jackson emerged. David ducked back out of sight. Jackson carried a harness. He went to Keno and began fitting it on the dog. David kept the shed between them, backed away through the brush, and hurried off. He met Grace on the corner, and the moment she got off the bus, he said, "You want to see Scrub? Come on." They hurried up the trail through the brush and crept behind the shed. "Peek around the corner real easy," David whispered. "Don't let Jackson see you. Scrub's the first one." Grace carefully inched her head out. "Gee," she whispered back. "He's beautiful, just like you said. He looks exactly like that little carving we saw." "You can go and take a good look at him if you want," David said. "I can't. If Scrub sees me, he'll start barking. Then Jackson will come out and there'll be trouble." Grace stepped from behind the shed and approached Scrub. Scrub turned to face her, big head down, amber eyes looking obliquely up at her as she approached. Then he lifted his head and his tail began to weave. Grace was within a few feet of him when the door opened and Jackson's nasal voice yelled, "Hey, kid, what do you think you're doing?" I'm looking at them," Grace stammered. "What's a kid like you looking at dogs for?" Jackson demanded suspiciously. She pointed at Scrub. "I've heard about him. That's Scrub, isn't it?" "Where'd you hear about him?" "In the paper. They said he was a great lead dog." "Said that, huh?" Jackson was pleased. "All right, you can have a look." Grace walked closer to Scrub. He stood at the end of the chain, waving his tail in invitation. "Can I pet him?" she asked. "No, you've had a good look. Now beat it. Get." Grace ran back to David behind the shed, and they left hurriedly, keeping the shed between them and Jackson. Once down the trail, Grace said, "I don't like that Smiley Jackson. He looks mean. I wish there was some way we could get Scrub away from him." "There's no way," David said. "And besides, how could we keep him in the city? Aunt Margaret said no dogs. I know. School closed. The next 3 days, Anchorage gave over to the fur rendezvous. The Rondi, Alaskans called it. Holiday air gripped the city. Everything was done with but one thing in mind: entertainment and fun. Trappers emerged from the wilderness with their winter harvests of fur. All along the street, racks were set up and hung with furs where people might shop and bargain. A fur auction would be part of the festivities. There were stalls of Eskimo carvings and trinkets. There would be games and contests of all kinds. A foot race in the snow, a parka parade, a children's one-dog race. A dignitaries race would feature the mayor and two of the city's leading businessmen and the queen of the fur rendezvous. 2 radio disc jockeys planned a race with the radio station operators. A spectacle never before seen was scheduled this year. The queen and her court were to be pulled through the streets by teams of dogs hooked end to end, almost a quarter mile in length. Scramble races in which drivers tried to snatch dollar bills from an overhead wire, a weight-pulling contest for single dogs, and a weight-carrying match for men were all part of the entertainment. The big race for a $5,000 prize was the event that claimed all of Anchorage's attention. It was 75 miles and would be run in 3 heats of 25 miles each day. The team with the fastest overall time for the 3 days would be declared winner. The course wound across the tundra through brush, timber, ravines, making a 25-mile circle that ended back at the starting line. Checkers stationed along the trail would make sure rules were obeyed. A helicopter would fly over the course, radioing the progress of the teams back to the crowd waiting in Anchorage. Whenever possible, or wherever people congregated, the talk was of mushers, teams, and lead dogs. David soon learned the names of the favorites and how the betting was going. Charlie White, an Eskimo from Kotzebue, was the choice to win. After that came Mel Johnson and Eddie Small, in that order. Other names cropped up in place, but no one topped Charlie White to win. David heard Jackson's name mentioned a number of times, but no one picked him to win or even place in the money. The morning the race began, most of Anchorage was present to see the start. 4th Street was roped off to hold back the crowd and give teams and mushers room. David was there with his uncle and Aunt Grace. Terry was off somewhere with his friends. The 30 teams were lined up waiting the starter's gun. Jackson had drawn number 17. He would start in that position. The teams would take off at 2-minute intervals. David moved up behind people and got within a few feet of Scrub. Every dog knew what was to happen and was alert and anxious. The team holding number 1 position pulled to the starting line. The pistol cracked. The dogs were flying down the street to the cheers of the crowd. One by one, the teams took off. When Jackson's turn came, David crowded close. At the sound of the pistol, the team lunged forward as one dog. Scrub led the team down the street at breakneck speed and out onto the tundra. A man near David said, "Nice start. That leader really takes him." A few minutes later, the helicopter began sending back information on the progress of the race. Radios along the street relayed the reports. Uncle George and Aunt Margaret wandered about among the racks of furs and Eskimo carvings. The children's one-dog race was about to begin. The parka parade would follow to fill in time until the teams began arriving back in town. David and Grace hunted up a radio and listened to the helicopter reports. At the 10-mile mark, Jackson passed number 16, then number 15. Other teams were passing, dropping back, passing again. A half-dozen had already been scratched for infractions of the rules. One team took out after a cow moose that crossed the trail in front of it. The dogs wrapped the sled around a tree. 2 teams got into a fight, and both were so badly tangled they were eliminated. At the 20-mile mark, Jackson passed number 14. David caught himself saying under his breath, "Come on, Scrub, come on." He was pulling for Smiley Jackson, too, but he didn't care. "Scrub's winning. He's winning!" Grace burst out. "Not yet," David said, "but he's catching them." The radio blared, "Jackson, number 17, past 13. This Jackson team is coming." The children's race and the parka parade were over. The crowd began congregating again at the finish line. "They'll start coming in a few minutes," David said. "Let's watch them come into town." They raced through an alley to the next street. The teams would come off the tundra here, turn and race down the main street to the finish line. A small crowd had already gathered. They waited about 10 minutes. Then the first team came over the horizon. Other teams began appearing one by one. A big man near David watched through powerful binoculars and announced each team to the crowd as it appeared. Charlie White, the Eskimo man from Kotzebue, is leading. There comes Mel Johnson in second place and Eddie Small in third. The next three I don't know. That seventh one looks familiar. He screwed his eyepieces around. It's Jackson! And look at that big leader dig in. He's going to pass number 6. David's heart leaped. Mister, would you let me look through those glasses? He asked tensely. The man glanced down. They'll be here soon, boy. Smiley Jackson's lead dog belongs to Davy, Grace piped. The man lowered the glasses and looked at David, then he handed them to the boy. Here, Musher, watch your dog come in. He's a real go-getter. David picked up Scrub immediately. The trail was wide. There was plenty of room to pass. Scrub was even with the lead dog of number 6 position. His big head was down, his back humped. He was digging in for all he was worth. Grace was yanking on David's sleeve, fairly dancing. Let me see, Davy, let me see. He handed her the glasses. She looked and began yelling. He's passing! He's passed! He's in 5th! A big man said, good. Or the big man said, good, and reached for the glasses. A minute later, the first 5 teams swept onto the street. Jackson was holding down 5th place. He popped the whip over the dogs' straining backs and yelled like mad. They had passed so many teams on the trail that his time could make him winner of the race. Come on! David grabbed Grace's hand, and they ran back through the alley for the finish line to hear the time announced. All 5 teams had crossed. Every dog was flat on the snow. Some were plainly exhausted. David's eyes found Scrub. He was lying down, but his big head was up, his tongue lolling out, panting. He was tired, but to David he looked as if he could go again. Other teams were arriving amidst confusion and uproar. People shouted encouragement. Dogs barked. A team ran wild into the crowd. For some strange reason, one team took a fancy to a light pole and began circling it at top speed to howls from the crowd and angry shouts from the musher. Down the street, a man with a camera stepped into the path of a running team and snapped its picture. At the flash, the startled dogs jumped the curb onto the sidewalk, smashing the sled. A half-dozen spectators promptly tossed the cameraman headfirst into a snowbank. David paid no attention. He was waiting for the public address system to announce the time. The voice boomed over the crowd and stilled the noise. Ladies and gentlemen, in first place, Charlie White, time 2 hours, 30 seconds. Second place, Smiley Jackson, time 2 hours, 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Third place, N.Y. Sullivan, 2 hours, 5 minutes and 10 seconds. Fourth, Wilford Thompson, 2 hours, 7 minutes and 47 seconds. David didn't wait for more. Scrub was second, only 3 minutes 20 seconds behind first place. Maybe tomorrow he'd be first. When David got into bed that night, he looked at the little ivory statue a long time. He kept seeing Scrub as he swung into the street, head down, digging. The excitement of the race kept bubbling within him. He got very little sleep. Only 21 teams started the second day. David and Grace watched the start and cheered when Scrub led his team down the street and out onto the tundra. The dignitaries' race between the mayor, the businessmen, the rendezvous queen, and the grudge race between the disc jockeys occupied the time until the teams began returning. David and Grace stuck close to the radio to hear the helicopter reports. The only team ahead of Jackson was Charlie White. He held his position, but Jackson was close on his heels. Behind them, other teams jockeyed back and forth. Again, David and Grace ran down the alley to the other street to watch the teams come in off the tundra. The big man with the binoculars was there. He grinned at David and held out the glasses. Hi, Musher, want to watch your dog come in? Scrub was scant feet behind Charlie White when the team hit the end of the street. He held that spot all the way to the finish line. David and Grace dashed back down the alley to hear the time announced. Number 1, Smiley Jackson, 2 hours, 2 minutes, 7 seconds. Number 2, Charlie White, 2 hours, 5 minutes, 57 seconds. Scrub had a 30-second lead in overall time. When they reached home, David went immediately to his room. He wanted to be alone to think about the race and Scrub. He was happy the dog had won. The betting was changing. The talk on the street when he left favored Jackson to win the final heat. David was sure that after the final 25-mile race tomorrow, Scrub would be a champion. He wondered what the people of Aurora would think then about Scrub. About the Scrub they'd rocked and chased all winter. He'd give anything to hold that big head in his hands again, to put his arms around the dog's neck and press his face against the furry forehead. Excitement was high the next morning when the starter's gun sent the teams pounding down the street. There were 16 teams still in the race. They were soon gone. The intervening time was taken up by the weight-pulling contest for single dogs, the scramble race, and the obstacle race. But this time, David noticed more people clustered about the radios, following the progress of the race. At the 10-mile post, 2 teams were scratched for rule infractions. A dog collapsed on number 21, which meant that team would not do well. Number 15 crashed into a rock and broke a sled runner. The first 4 teams to leave the starting line held their positions. Charlie White had closed a little on Jackson, but not enough to try to pass. At mile 15, the positions of the first 4 remained unchanged. At mile 20, number 19 in 5th place moved up and closed on the 4th place sled of Wilfred Thompson. Jackson still clung to 1st place with Charlie White on his heels. "Come on," David said. "Let's see them come in." Once again, Grace and he raced hand in hand through the alley to the next street. The small crowd was there. The big man with the binoculars was scanning the trail. "Do you see them yet?" David asked breathlessly. "Oh, hello, Musher. No, not yet. But I heard your dog was still holding a slim lead." A couple of minutes later, the man said, "Here comes one, and there's another, and another." "Who's leading?" David asked excitedly. "Are Scrub and Smiley Jackson leading?" "Pretty far yet. Can't tell for sure." He screwed the eyepieces around. "Ah, there they are." He handed the glasses to David. "Here, see for yourself." Scrub came into the lens of the lead, in the lead. His head was down, his back hunched with effort. The whole team was running with every ounce of speed and strength they possessed. He could see Jackson on the handlebars, see his arms swing back and forward. It was too far to hear the crack of the lash. Charlie White was close behind Jackson, his dog straining every ounce. The next 3 teams were coming into view, closely bunched. Grace jerked at his sleeve. "Let me see, David, let me see." She had her look and began dancing up and down, chanting, "Scrub's going to win! He's going to win!" "Maybe." The big man reached for his glasses. "But Charlie White's too close for comfort. Jackson could come in first, but still lose the race if White picks up the few seconds he lost yesterday. Remember, you win on the shortest overall time, young lady." "I forgot," Grace said. The team hit the end of the street. Jackson jumped from the runners and began to run, shoving the sled right up to the tail enders, so the dogs didn't have to pull even the light weight of the sled. All they had to do was run, and Scrub kept the line straight and headed down the center of the street. Behind them, Charlie White had jumped off the runners and was pushing. "It's going to be close," the big man said. "If Jackson can hold the pace, he's got it by a couple of seconds." He let out a wild yell. "Come on, Jackson! Come on, Scrub! Come on!" The rest of the crowd began to chant. "Come on, Scrub! Come on!" David was so excited he didn't realize he moved a step beyond the rest and was shouting at the top of his voice, "Come on, Scrub! Come on, you can do it! Go, go, go!" His voice, sharp, clear, and high, carried to the sensitive ears of the dog. Scrub turned his head. The amber eyes searched the crowd and found the boy. With a glad bark, he headed straight for David. The whole team followed obediently. Jackson began to scream and curse. The whip lashed out again and again. David suddenly realized what had happened. He yelled, "No, Scrub, no, no, go back, go back!" The sound of his voice only added to the dog's desire to reach him. David turned to run back into the crowd and lose himself. His foot struck a piece of ice and he sprawled in the snow. The next moment, Scrub was on him, whining and crying and licking his face. He tried to push the dog off. To get to his feet, Scrub kept whimpering and licking his face. His weight knocked David flat. David was on his knees, trying to rise and fend off the ardent Scrub, when Smiley Jackson was upon them. He slashed at David's head with the heavy butt of the whip. The blow knocked him down. Then he struck again and again at Scrub in an insane rage. His lips were drawn back, his face twisted. The long scar pulled the corners of his mouth into grotesque shape. He struck David again. Remembering that other time, David threw his arms over his face and tried to roll away. The clubbing landed on his shoulders. head and back with numbing force. Then it stopped. The big man had torn the whip from Jackson's hands. Others dragged him away. David scrambled to his feet as the second, third, and fourth place teams flashed past, heading for the finish line. "I'll get you!" Jackson kept screaming. "I'll get you! You done that on purpose!" A man held Scrub, pulled and whined and whimpered. He pulled and whined and whimpered, trying to get to David. Others turned the team around and led it up the street, out of David's sight. The big man handed Jackson his whip without a word. Jackson held the whip and glared at David. The presence of spectators kept him from leaping on the boy. He started to speak, then shook his head with a savage gesture and turned away. He went to his team and headed it into a side street. He had not only lost first place, he was out of the money. And the fact that he had struck a spectator would surely disqualify him from the race. Grace held David's arm and asked anxiously, "Gee, Davy, are you all right? He hit you awful hard." His head ached, but his cap and turned-up collar had dulled most of the blows. "I'm all right," he muttered. The big man said, "Your Scrub ran a mighty good race, Musher. I'm sorry you lost." And that's the end of chapter 10.